Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude's weekly ADHD Experts broadcast. Today, we want to welcome all of you out there starting school, getting ready for school, because we'll be talking with two terrific school experts, Karen Huberty and Maureen Bechard, about helping children with ADHD improve their executive function skills in the classroom as well as at home. I just want to mention to all of you who are listening in live now or maybe listening later to this webinar in the replay version that if you'd like a certificate of attendance, please stay through the end of the webinar and complete the brief quiz that will appear in your screen. If you're a replay listener, just be sure you're listening to the webinar, not on attitudemag.com, but on the original host GoToWebcast. So we're pleased to be able to offer those certificates. We're still working out the kinks, but I think it's been helpful for all of our listeners. Today, executive functions, pretty much teachers and parents recognize weak executive functions when they see them. They know that disorganized projects, incomplete homework, forgotten chores, that's executive function for you. But strategies to strengthen these skills are really less obvious. But in fact, as we'll hear today, teaching executive function skills takes time, takes practice, and teacher support, but it can be done. So today, Karen and Maureen will explain an effective sort of multi-step plan for sharpening executive functions by identifying the strengths and weaknesses, advocating for strategies that address the weaknesses, and setting up an executive function-friendly classroom. We're so pleased to have them. I'd like to introduce them first to you. Maureen Bechard is a licensed professional school counselor who has loved working with middle school students for more than 30 years. She promotes a greater understanding of how ADHD affects the lives of adolescents during their middle school years, and she has found that strategies that are good for ADHD kids work for all students. So Maureen's a believer that middle schoolers with ADHD can inspire the world to be a brighter, more positive place. Karen Huberty, M.Ed, has a passion for teaching students with ADHD also and educating students and staff about executive functioning skills. She has presented widely in her district in the Minnesota Education Academy at the ADHD National ADHD Conference in 2018. She's been awarded the Rotary Teacher of the Year for innovation in teaching executive function strategies to students, parents, and staff, and received many grants from the Education Minnesota Foundation for Excellence in Teaching. So we are really pleased to have these two really dedicated and expert teachers with us. I want to mention their consulting services, which are called, I love this, I Forgot to Remember Executive Functioning Consulting. They serve as consultants to K-12 schools, to higher education, and for parent support. So you can email Maureen and Karen at iforgottoremember@gmail.com. So Maureen and Karen, thank you so much for joining us today. We really look forward to this presentation. Let me just give our listeners a few comments on how things work. You might be new to Attitude webinars. Our speakers will present for about a half an hour or so, and then they will take your questions. You may enter your questions in the Ask a Question section of the screen. Do that whenever they occur to you, or we'll ask you for them at the end of the presentation. You may download the slide presentation now if you'd like to, and by clicking the Download the Webinar Slides link in the Event Resources section of the screen. If you are having audio problems, it's universally caused by slow internet connection or an incompatible browser. If you're on Wi-Fi, you may well have a problem. Wired internet is the best, and don't forget to close any other programs or open tabs just to maximize your bandwidth, and refresh your page if you have any trouble. So let's hope for clear sound for everyone listening in today. And with that, let me turn it over to Maureen and Karen.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, thanks, Susan, for that warm welcome. As a counselor for over 30 years and as Karen as a teacher for over 20 years, we have seen so many things change in our schools, and it's becoming really hard to help our kiddos, all of our kiddos. So thanks for listening. We hope our work and our ideas do something for all of you, provide some possible great strategies to try, some really great solutions out there. And we just want to help all of our ADHD kiddos and all of our kiddos to be who they really can be at the end of the line. So.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. We have a lot of information to cover today, and 30 minutes is not a lot of time. So again, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out through the question bar or email us at the end. But our ultimate goal is for you today, and we have 5 of them. The first one is to have an understanding of how important it is to teach executive functioning language to all of our learners, not just students who have identified diagnosis of ADHD, but to all the students that we work with. How do we assist those students in identifying those individual strengths and areas of need? And we refer to them as areas of need and not as deficits. I think the word need is a little more user-friendly, and we all have them, right? We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. How do we teach our students how to advocate for themselves? We don't want to be their frontal lobe for the rest of their lives. We need to teach them some skills to ask for help when they need it. And then how do we create a classroom so that our kids are able to function, they can get the skills and get the assistance that they need without a teacher being overwhelmed by everybody trying to manage that. And probably one of the most important things in education right now is just that promotion of mental health conditions and how that positively impacts kids that we work with.
So executive functions, what are executive functions? They are all the resources, all the skills, all the tools we need to accomplish things, to achieve things, to be successful in school. And we have followed Thomas E. Brown's model, and you can see it there. He's broken it down into 6 different parts. We, later on, we'll break it down a little bit further, but these were the tools that we found to really connect with what we're doing with middle school kids, and it reaches them. So you can see the sources there of the executive function sources, and we'll break them down here in the next little bit.
We're going to talk a lot about executive function language and how important that is to use it with our students. And I've had no training on executive function, very little of ADHD in my undergraduate work, 20 some years ago. So it's taken me a while to learn through this process and understand how important this language really is, and that we all have executive functioning skills, areas of strength, areas of need. But when we're working with our kids, we use this language. I use this language with my own children. I use this language with my husband. But these are words that we use, and when kids have an understanding of them, they're able to use this language too. We like to think of executive functions in 2 different ways. The first part is the thinking or the cognition part. So we've listed out, these are the 5 terms that fall under that category. Working memory. How do you keep all of that information to complete a task from point A to point B? Finish that math assignment and then turn it into the basket. I always tell my students my area of weakness is working memory. If they look at Miss Huberty's desk, there's sticky notes all over, because if I don't write it down right when I'm thinking about it, it's out of my mind. So it's important for my kids to see. That's something that I'm working on. Organizational skills. How do you keep all of your assignments organized? How do you make sure you get them turned in once they're completed? A big time of organization kind of disarray happens when kids are going from 5th grade to 6th grade. So going from that sheltered, smaller classroom to a class, where you have 8 different teachers and you're transitioning throughout your day. And then kids struggle a lot between 8th grade and 9th grade with organization because you're going from, a classroom, middle school situation where you have grades, but they're not for credit. Once you get to high school, those are for credit. So organization, those are 2 big time periods in kids' lives where that's really difficult. Time management, obviously this is probably one of the biggest areas of need our kids have, is how do you determine how much time something needs to be completed? A kid might think it's only going to take me 15 minutes to finish my math assignment. So they wait till 8 o'clock, and then 8 o'clock comes and that 15-minute math assignment turns into an hour and 15 minutes. So how can we help kids understand that time piece? Self-understanding, or that metacognition. And I like to use that word a lot with my students because they think it sounds really fancy and they sound really smart, but really it just means how well do we understand ourselves? And then that planning or prioritizing. How do you decide this is what's most important and it needs to be done first? So that's more of the thinking or the cognition terms that we use with our students.
Okay, breaking it down into the executive skills involving doing the behaviors. And these are things we can see. These are things that usually hear comments about in your classrooms, or your child will be commented about. Emotional control, the ability to stay calm even when faced with situations that make you sad, mad, angry, frustrated. Response inhibition or behavior control, the ability to think before you act, stop, think, do. That's really difficult. Kids quite often have those audiences of others looking at them. They're their main influences. Quite often it is hard to stop, think, and do. Attention, the ability to stay focused when something's not interesting to you. The ability to keep going when there's other distractions. Hard in all the transition parts of their life, hard in middle school, hard at all levels. The initiative, the ability to start projects without having someone tell you to do it. That's a big challenge for middle schoolers, and I think even on into high school for sure. Persistence, the ability to stick with a boring task from start to finish. As they go through school, the steps become much more complicated, much more difficult. How do you keep going? How do you persist? You might be tired, you might be hungry, you might be distracted. You have to keep going. And then flexibility, the ability to make changes in your behavior or schedule. Some kids are rigid. Some kids, need things to go as they thought they were going to go. But flexibility is an executive function that all our kiddos need to develop as they go through. So what's the difference between ADHD and executive functions? Well, we already explained what executive functions were. Those are all the skills we need to accomplish our tasks, all those skills we need to get through school. ADHD is a medical diagnosis. It's a brain-based condition, and quite often those kids have big-time troubles with concentration, working memory, organizing. They may be impulsive. They might be hyperactive. They have a difficult time managing themselves. So ADHD kiddos have executive functions that can be severely impaired, and they may have multiple executive functions that severely are impaired, which make doing school really complicated, make it really hard. Now, we all have executive functions, and we all have some things we can do well and some things that, we don't do so well all the time. But many of us have figured out, how to support our executive functions that are not as strong. Our ADHD kids need us to help them. They need us to provide some atmospheres that make it easier to become stronger.
All right. We're going to look at two students here. And as we're looking at them, I'm going to think about which student has needs in executive functioning. Thinking about the things that we just talked about, right? Student A, this student academically, school is her gig, right? She's 100% or higher in all of her classes. She's got that partial grade advancement because school is her thing. Socially, has that internal motivation, can work independently, but can also work in a group situation, has outside interests that are varied, and has parent involvement. So we have student A. When we look at student B, academically, this is a student who has difficulty completing work. This is a little guy who has 5 of the same math worksheets that are completed just in the bottom of his locker, have never gotten turned in. Socially, this student struggles to keep his body to himself, has difficulty sitting in a chair, is running through the hallway, has outside interests, and also has great parent involvement. But when you're looking at these two kids, right, student B is the one who's showing significant need in the area of executive functioning in a multitude of ways. But really, student A is the one with an ADHD diagnosis. So the point of me putting this slide in is that, we service students in our class that have a diagnosis, and they probably struggle with executive function difficulties in other ways. But we have student B who doesn't have any diagnosis, but that little guy needs my time and needs my assistance in our classroom more than student A. So I'm just being aware that just because a student doesn't have a label doesn't mean that they don't need the support in executive functions as well.
Okay, so the 4 tiers of support.
Yes, we'll talk a little bit about the 4 tiers of support. So after, spending a lot of time working through this and just trying to figure out what was going to work best for my kids, this was a strategy or a set of tips that I have started to use in my classroom. So the first one, again, is to teach that common language. All of my students have an understanding of what that language is, what that means. The next one is I want kids to know, what is it you do well and what is it you need some help in? Again, we don't want to be that frontal lobe for kids forever and ever. So I need to teach them how to advocate for themselves. And how do you set that up for other teachers to model so that you can support all your kids without being overwhelmed? So the next slide talks about common language. Mo, do you want to talk about?
Yeah, the teaching common language. So executive functions, we want to get this common language out throughout all of our people we're working with in the schools, with families. So executive functions are all those skills we need to complete, to do a given task. We talk about strengths with students. We talk about areas of needs. And when we use this language across the building, we have things posted in our classrooms, in our counselor's office, in the conference meeting offices where we meet with parents. We want administrators to use this language. We want to use it with parents to begin that positive interaction. We use it in staff meetings when we're trying to problem solve for students. And in my work as a counselor, I get to use it ongoing, one-on-one with students. And going out from there, as you may have experienced, you can talk about with pediatricians, therapists, whoever you work with to support your child. So identifying your strengths and areas of need. How we do it at our school, we're fortunate as counselors to be able to go into the classrooms, and we start in the 6th grade. Our building starts with 6th grade middle school, and the kids are here for about 4 weeks, and then we get to go into the classrooms, and counselors give 2-day presentations. And in those presentations, we introduce the language of executive functions. And we also have interactive activities. We watch some fun videos. The students complete their own survey. And it creates a really positive environment for our students to share their own situations. And it's one of the best days of being a middle school counselors because the kids love it. They love to talk about themselves. They've heard all their lives what they're not so great at, and they're looking for solutions. And it also validates, hey, we're all working on this. We're all on a journey. We're here to help you develop those skills.
Here's a little picture of Maureen going through doing some of those interactive lessons. And I think what's important too, you may be questioning, like, where are they getting these executive functioning surveys? There are tons of informal executive functioning surveys for all grade levels that you can find, that you can modify to fit on your own. Obviously, there are professional ones as well. The brief is probably the most common that is used. But you are able to access those. We've kind of created our own set of executive functioning surveys to work for our setting. But when students take these surveys, it's really fun, like Maureen said. She spends a lot of time explaining that and talking through with kids. But they come away with this survey. And again, that general discussion with kids, what does this language mean? How do we identify what those strengths and areas of need are? And a really great time to talk about kids individually, if you are able to, is during conference time. We have student-led conferences at our middle school, and so we actually put these into their portfolio. So it's something that we bring out and we talk about with mom and dad and with the student. And it's a time where parents often will get to see a side of their student or see an area of need that maybe they hadn't recognized before. I had a student a couple of years ago. She was a gifted and talented student, did phenomenal with lots of activities. But her area of need was attention. And mom and dad had no idea. And the little girl actually started crying. And she said, I have such a difficult time staying focused and paying attention when it's managed independent work time. So that was something mom and dad had never heard. The little girl had never shared that before. So we came up with some strategies, some things for her to do in class to advocate for herself in other situations. And it was great. So just to have that conversation and just for kids to be self-aware is really important. So these next two slides we're going to talk about, I pulled from the Executive Functioning Workbook for Teens by Sharon Hansen. So this was a great resource that I found early on when I was researching how to work with executive functions, how to teach that to my students. So in my building, when I was teaching special ed, that I was fortunate enough to teach a study skills class. And I really targeted towards, I wanted to have students who had a diagnosis of ADHD or that other health disability label. And so we used this workbook the kids had. We were going through the lessons, and we came to this lesson that talked about the area of need that they needed to work on the most, right? And I gave the kids 3 options. I said, you could write about it, you can draw about it, or you can talk about it, whichever one you would like to do. And every single one of these 8th grade students chose to draw, which I thought was kind of interesting. So this little guy, he said his area of need that he needed to work on the most was in attention, right? Something that he was afraid of was not getting the instructions that he needed to know. And if you look at his picture, his greatest area of need or his beast, I think it's cool that Sharon Hansen refers to it as a beast. He's sitting at his desk, like ready to poke his eye out, and the teacher's talking, blah, blah, blah. So I knew that this student struggled with attention, but I didn't realize to what extent he did. And so this graphic was a great way, and we had a really, really good conversation after that. This picture breaks my heart every time I see it. This is a student who I knew struggled with flexibility. I knew that that was an area of need for executive function for him. But what I didn't know is the anxiety that this area of need was causing him. And so, something he was afraid of was not being able to get his homework done. And if you look at the picture, he's in the corner, saying gulp, and then the teacher is a big, mean, scary teacher, icky teeth and horns, saying, hurry up, you have to get your work done. So again, I knew that this student struggled with flexibility, but I had no idea that the impact that his anxiety was causing him and getting in the way of his learning. So again, this is a great workbook if you're looking for something to use with students or your child. This is a fun way, even for 8th grade students, to be able to look at some of their learning. It looks like our slides jumped around a little bit. Here we go. So I'm going to quickly talk about how teachers can take this information away. So they have those executive functioning surveys. When I was a special education teacher, I used that information constantly, specifically when I was writing present levels of performance and IEPs, creating accommodations for those IEPs, or when I was working with our administration on writing 504s. The kids are telling us what they need. And the older they get, even, 3rd grade and up, that's a perfect time to have the student involved in making those accommodations, because their area of need is going to direct what types of accommodations that they need. I think it's important for counselors to understand that area of need as well, so they can help advocate for their students. It's important for teachers to have that good understanding. Oops, I'm not sure what's going on with our slides here. We are jumping around. Making sure that teachers are aware as well as administration. I think sometimes when you're jumping in to deal with a behavior problem, oftentimes it stems from their executive functioning areas of need.
All right, survey takeaway for parents. I have been a counselor for like 25 years, and part of that has gone really, really smooth. And sometimes one of the hardest things to do is have really meaningful conversations with parents about things that are difficult. And people don't always want to hear the difficult pieces. And how do you say it in a positive tone? So this whole process has been just one of the most amazing parts for me. The survey takeaway for parents at conferences, we can talk about what's happening. We can get the child's perspective, because we have student-led conferences, the child's perspective, we can get the teacher's perspective, we can get the parents. It lays some really positive groundwork for other conversations, because you're using terms that make sense and aren't negative. Once you start to talk about this, we all have these strengths and needs, so parents can click onto it. They are like, well, that sounded like me, or maybe that's what I see, or that's really hard. Adults, you can talk about, they've learned to make their own accommodations, and they've maybe found jobs that work for their strengths. And we can teach students how to do that once we recognize what those things are, once we have that 3-tiered approach, the school, the parents, the child all working together. We can teach skills, and they can advocate for themselves. And it's, as we talk about executive functions, if we need to get to deeper conversations or lead to more outside interventions, then we can talk about ADHD, or if it's possibly anxiety or what it might be. But the survey takeaway for parents has just been amazing from my viewpoint as a counselor.
I want to walk you through just a mini lesson that I use in my classroom. Again, this takes place in the fall. The kids have had some time to get to know their teachers, and they've taken the survey. So what I have my students do is they all bring their surveys into class. So again, I'm a language arts teacher. I'm still teaching 6th grade, reading and writing standards. We have a lot going on, but this is so important to me that I build time into my day. And we'll talk more about how to do that later on. But I have my students come in with their surveys, and what I ask them to do is I ask them to pick out, what is your biggest area of strength? Like, what are you so proud of, the most successful area for you, right? And again, mine would be, let's say, organization. So what I have the students do is I create posters, and I put them all over the room. And at the top of each of the posters is one of the areas of executive function. So I ask the kids, take that one area of strength that you have, the one that you do the absolute best, you feel most confident in, and I want you to go stand by that poster. So the kids scatter around the room, they go to their different poster. And what I have them do is I set the timer for 10 or 15 minutes, and I say, okay, I want you to spend as much time as you can writing down every single thing you do in that area to make you be successful or help you be successful. And the kids, they loved it. They wrote all over the posters, the organization poster was obviously perfect and had bullet points. Others, the kids just were writing ideas all over the place. And we spent almost an entire class period going through that. We came back the next day, and what I asked the students to do, I said, okay, now we've spent time talking about our areas of strength, and you guys wrote down all the strategies that you use. What we're going to do today is I want you to go to the poster that is your biggest area of need. Okay, so let's say mine was working memory. So the students would go to that poster, and they would read through everything that was there. And I would say, okay, I want you to pick one thing from that poster that you can try today to help yourself in that area. And it was, it was one of those things when you teach middle school, you never quite know how something's going to go. And it was one of my favorite days of the fall. So the kids really had a great takeaway from it. They were talking about that language. We posted those so that they were constantly available for kids to reference. But just as another tool or another mini lesson that you could use when you're talking about executive function. So picture my kiddos. So these next few slides, I think, are probably the biggest takeaways that I want people to get from this presentation, and what I feel most passionate about and what has driven me to be an advocate for kids with executive functioning needs. It's important that all of your students buy into this way of thinking. At first, when I started this journey, not all the staff in my building bought in, and that's okay, but I needed my students to buy in. And I did that by starting it at the beginning of the year, and it just became my class culture. Again, I'm still responsible for Minnesota State Standards and Language Arts. We had a lot to cover, but by building in talk of executive functions, how to advocate for yourself, not just to sit there without a pencil and not do anything about it. Like, what are you going to do? So by building that up, that time in my day was so very important for me. We constructed class norms for the tools that we'll talk about in a few minutes, and what they were for and how were they to be used and how do we take care of those things. And if problems came up, we just referred back to the norms. But the biggest thing I want you to take away is that the tools are available for all students. And let me talk a little bit more about that. I like to think of it as the shiny and new thought, right? I have a classroom full of a lot of stuff. I have exercise bikes, noise canceling headphones, alternate seating, standing tables. I have a lot of stuff in here, and we talk a lot about how kids can use that to help with their needs. But what's really cool about this way of thinking is that it's all shiny and new, and everybody wants to use the tools and use these strategies right away, right? But then what is so special is that the shiny and new wears off, right? Just like your toys that your kid has in the closet, they don't use anymore. The shiny new wears off, but this is the biggest takeaway. The tools that are left, or kids that don't need them anymore, there's not that stigma attached for the kids who do need them. And this is where I've seen like miracles happen in my classroom, that kids who would not use their accommodations on their IEP or 504 because they were afraid of being singled out, that was no longer the case in the setting, because they were able to see that these tools are available for everybody. So if I need it, I'm going to use it. And that is, I think, one of the most important things is that if you set it up in your classroom so that everybody has access to what they need if they need it, then it's amazing things will happen. We're going to go through just a couple of the tools that we have, and I know people, I'm sure, will have lots of questions on how we access these things and where they came from. Something that my students will be able to tell you is kind of my mantra of the classroom, is a fidget versus a toy. So I tell my students anything can be a fidget. It could be a paper clip, it could be a stress ball, it could be your shoelace. I mean, anything could be a fidget. But what a fidget does is it takes that part of your brain that needs to be activated so that the other part of your brain can focus on the task at hand. And fidgets can be super, super powerful and really helpful in the classroom and outside of the classroom. But this is my mantra. Once a fidget starts to distract you or it starts to distract somebody else, it's no longer a fidget, it's a toy. And my kids can chant that all the time. What I know is really important, though, is that I don't ever tell a student, you don't ever get to use that fidget again because they were throwing it or tossing it or whatever. I'll say, hey, you know what, buddy, that's not working for you today. It's distracting you or it's distracting your neighbor. Let's put away. Let's try something else, or we'll try it again tomorrow. Which I think just shifting the way that I'm talking with kids is really important as well.
So moving on to the next one, number 3, monitoring. The noise canceling headphones, earbuds, iPads with some music in the background. Anything that can block out unwanted noise to limit distractions. These are all tools that can be used, and only needed if, the student thinks that's going to be helpful. And in our school, it's recognized as things that are okay for everybody to use, and the kids respect them. So that's just one more tool that can be used.
Again, we're in a middle school setting. We don't have recess anymore. So I recognized early on that we needed to move our bodies, and it wasn't just me, right? That I needed to move too, but my students needed time in their day. So I wrote a grant for some exercise bikes, for some foot pedal bikes. Foot bands are really popular right now. But we put these all together, and I gave them away to any teacher in my building that wanted access to them. And again, we talked through what does it look like? When is an appropriate time to use them, right? It's not a free-for-all. I don't have an exercise spin class going on in here, but kids have access to them when they need them. And we talk about when is an appropriate time, but just to give the kids, this is an opportunity for you to move your body if you need to. Alternate seating, I think, is really important, especially with, kind of the new wave of flexible seating. At this point, I do have standing desks in my classroom. I have lap desks, swivel chairs. We have study crowds. It's another way for students to learn. There's a time and a place, and again, that's part of that setup at the beginning of the year in my classroom, and just kind of our class culture on when these tools are available, how we use the tools, and how we take care of the tools.
Okay, another big piece is the focus time management. So timers, analog clocks, iPhone reminders, tech reminders, actual paper calendars where they actually write things in and see how it moves on time, and putting in their own commitments they have outside of school. Another great idea is just take time at every beginning of every class to collect thoughts, run through what's going to happen. Encourage kids to pause and think, especially the kids that really struggle with some of these things. But ADHD kids have a lot of difficulty with time management. Time is different to them on a lot of different levels. So we have to recognize that and encourage them to try some strategies to improve that.
We're just going to talk briefly about this slide because I'm sure many of the questions we'll get today have to do with these. But just some common concerns that we have: how classroom management, you don't want to be considered the fun teacher with all of these crazy tools in your room. How do I manage those materials? How do I build time in? And I'm sure funding will come up as well. So I'll be happy to answer those questions for you. But for the sake of time, we're going to skip over this one, and I'll answer your questions at the end. Something that's really important too, yes, in my classroom, those accommodations for students who have an IEP or for a 504 are done in my classroom. Again, my previous life as a special ed teacher has me honed into that. But what's really important to recognize is even if we are doing all of those things in our classroom, that an IEP and a 504 is still a legal document that needs to be followed, and those accommodations are designed for that specific student. So making sure that those still are being followed. But I can tell you, by setting up your classroom this way, that the students and the parents, I think, are probably the most grateful that their students are actually using their accommodations when they're in this setting, because they aren't doing single out. But again, if a student leaves my classroom or goes to a different classroom, leaves the district, leaves the building, that we still need to have those formal accommodations put in place.
All right, the mental health piece. As you can see there, there's a great graphic put out by NAMI. And one of the takeaways from that graphic that's listed there is half of all mental illnesses begin before the age of 14. So that's your middle school kids. That's your younger kids. Another great piece on that graphic that you can get a chance to take a look at or ask NAMI to send to you and your coworkers is that from the onset of the symptoms of either the mental health stuff, all varieties of them, it can take kids 8 to 10 years to get help or interventions with those pieces. So think of our kids going through our schools, going through high school, on to college. They're not always getting help. And mental health, we have to talk about it. It has to be part of this equation. It has to be parents being able to talk about it, teachers being able to talk about it, and looking for solutions. So we'll go through this pretty quickly because we are running out of time here. But in the past, our school response, and I think common school responses, were that, a kid might get ISS or OSS, out of school suspension or in school suspension. Maybe there'd be a special ed referral. Maybe we would just plain ignore the issues because maybe they're doing okay in their grades, but we'll just ignore whatever the other things that are going on here. Sometimes kids change schools. But one of the hardest things is if we weren't working on finding solutions is there's these ongoing and increasing conflicts that happen between families and schools, and the kids end up feeling really bad about themselves, which is there's no way we can learn that. So that's our old process. What we hopefully find in the new process by working through executive functions, if we have a school-wide awareness of it, if our students can identify where their areas of needs are, how they can work on things in their classrooms, in their academic settings. They advocate for themselves, they build their own skills, they get help from their teachers. And then still, if we're struggling, then we have some really good, meaningful conversations with the parents, staff, administrators, using common language that's positive and solution-oriented. And then if we need it, maybe there's a site-based mental health referral or possibly some outside therapy. If we need more assessments, on down the line we go. And maybe at the end, then we get to the special ed referral or a 504 plan. But if we look at children and their executive functions, their areas of need, and we find solutions early on, maybe we can, avoid some of these other things that cost more money and are difficult to implement.
So again, our overall goal for parents, as educators, is that we want students to be able to advocate for themselves. So this comes from Peg Dawson and Richard Warr. Environmental modifications, including teacher support, are important tools that can help children with weak executive skills function successfully. But our ultimate goal should be to help students develop their own executive skills so they can function independently. And again, those things can't happen unless we're using that language consistently. We're helping students identify strengths and areas of need. We're using our time with our kids in our classrooms to help support them. And we're getting that buy-in from students and other staff and from parents, and that we're following through to help our students be successful. Right. If you were just starting out, if executive functioning is new to you, as it was to me a few years ago, these were some resources that I found that were phenomenal. They were easy to understand, and it gave me a much better way of understanding executive functions, so I could speak about it to others, specifically parents and other staff members. But these are some great tools to start with if you're just looking for some place to start. Maureen and I do have a consulting business. I forgot to remember Executive Functioning Consulting. Our email address is there. If you have any questions about specific things we do in our classroom or with our school, we would love to hear from you. We have presented to school districts. We've presented at the Minnesota Education Academy in the state of Minnesota. We've taught some graduate classes for college students, and we've also worked with parents. So again, we're moms and sisters, and this has become what is the most important thing for us. So we'd be happy to hear from you. Susan, I think we're ready for some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you guys so much. That was chock full of information. Listeners, please post your questions. This is the time. I want to start, Maureen and Karen, by asking you to go over again the survey. It sounded like that was a really critical part of your approach. There were a number of listeners who didn't catch the name of the survey that you mentioned, apparently, and would be interested in hearing more about surveys that they can find and use and recommend at their schools.
The survey that we use, we kind of put together from a couple different sources that we found, and the list of resources that were posted at the end. We created our own that meets our middle school students' needs. So what we found is when we work with teachers of different, grade levels, we ask them to think about their own students, possibly look at the different things that are online and target, where your students' age are and create them. It's really a questionnaire of about 10 questions and breaking down what some of the challenges are with those executive functions, and kids identify their own. So we haven't created our...
Maybe it would be helpful if you would just describe, for example, what a couple of the kinds of questions would be and how a student might complete it. I think it's
So like under, there'd be a statement like under organization. In middle school, we'd say, how does your locker look? Is it a mess? Or you forget things often at home, or you don't come to class prepared. Under attention, we could put, you catch yourself daydreaming. You catch yourself missing out on what the teacher has just said. You find yourself distracted by noises in the classroom. So I think if, you go through some things that you find online, if you work with your counselors, if, you just kind of put together what you see from your own students, it kind of makes sense. So does that help?
our middle school, they have access to the brief, which would be a standardized assessment that can be given if you're specifically looking for a student with, ADHD or 504, IEP.
Okay, great. Question about how the surveys are implemented. Are they implemented in the classroom for all students, or is this something that specifically you do or you recommend doing with children with ADHD or other accommodations?
No, as counselors, we go into the entire sixth grade class, which in our building's like 400 sixth graders. And we give the entire presentation to every single person in class, going back to, we all have strengths, we all have areas of needs. We want the common language out there. So all students do it. The surveys then, the kids who have bigger struggles, you're going to see some of that. But then teachers who see the surveys after we've done them, like the home base or the flex teacher will see the surveys, then they can probably break down some more support for your ADHD kids or the kids who haven't been identified. Or as counselors, when I work with the kids one-on-one, I'll say, hey, how did your executive function survey turn out? Or tell me about that. And then we can talk about it from that. But we want all students to do it, because it's all something we can use and it's all part of all of our lives.
Right, that makes so much sense. How early, for example, elementary school, first grade, second grade, when would you see this? Is this a middle school phenomenon?
I don't
survey.
Think this one, sure. I think that you are able to, what your students should be able to do as far as attention. What your students should be able to do as far as organization. So you could create your own informal executive functioning survey based on those things. A short 3 or 4 little check mark, yes, this applies to me. And then you can go from there. So I think as early, as first, second, third grade, for sure, you're able to talk using that language. Elementary school teachers, again, I'm sixth grade, I'm that middle school brain, but elementary school teachers are phenomenal at being able to take something and putting it into language that would be useful or purposeful for you in your setting. But I think having that conversation, and you're obviously not going to use metacognition with a first grader, but you can talk about, how well do you understand yourself? And this is something I know I do well, and this is something I need to do with.
Okay, great. So, a number of parents listening in who are very envious of the students in your schools, and they're wondering what advice you have for them in terms of advocating for this kind of executive functioning focus in their child's school. Some people have said, where do I start? Who do I approach? How do I advocate for this?
Sure. Well, I can tell you, early on, I had a student, this is maybe my 3rd year of teaching. I had a student who had a diagnosis of ADHD, really struggled with executive functions. And his parents were aware of that language, and I was not. And they came in, guns blazing. And it was not a healthy relationship that we had, and it wasn't their fault. They were advocating for their child. Which is what you need to do as a parent, is to advocate. But the way that you approach it with a teacher, especially if they don't have that understanding of that background, that, by sharing resources, by meeting with other parents or other families in your building that have also similar needs, reaching out to your child's case manager are all great tools by, building that relationship ahead of time. Early on in the school year, sharing, these are things that my child, because when a parent just says, my child has ADHD, teachers have this, I get ADHD, I understand ADHD, but if a parent brings it more as, these are the areas of need that my child has in the area of executive function, and you can give specific examples on what that area of need is and how you're working on it with your child, I think it's a more safer approach, and I feel like you would probably get more out of that conversation. So by setting up a meeting before school starts, sending an email with some information is always really helpful. Depending on the relationship you have with your child's case manager administration, there are some phenomenal seminars that people can go to. The International Conference on ADHD is hands down the best professional development I have ever attended. So sharing that information with school staff has been really helpful, I think, too.
Okay.
Our middle school, if you would like. We would love to have all of your kids.
I wanted to turn to some specific areas of executive function that our listeners are are struggling with. Specifically, the one that's commonly mentioned in the questions is time management. Do you have some specific suggestions or tools for time management tools for students in high school?
Yeah.
I think one of the key things is marking it down on a paper calendar. I mean, that maybe seem old fashioned and, out of touch, but high school kids are so busy. Either they're working or they're involved in extra activities. And if they don't see the full range of what they need to get done by certain dates, and then there's those deadlines, they have to see time. They have to see days moving past. So I'm really firm believer on writing things on paper, getting those calendars going, encouraging maybe if they have a case manager to have the teacher help them with some of those pieces, probably trying to model it, yourself as a parent, maybe get that big family calendar up there. And, if, you need to get something done and it by Friday and you hope to do it on Monday and it didn't happen on Monday, you then put it on the list again for Tuesday and show the kids, hey, okay, now we got to get this done because we're running out of time. So any way you can show time moving is a great thing to do. Also, your ADHD kids are highly motivated, kind of when they're under pressure to get something done. So if you can add maybe some incentives to getting things done, I mean, if you can reward them for getting something done early or give them something they would really like to have or do, an experience by getting things done early, that can often work too. So
I'm just going to talk a couple ideas as a classroom teacher. We use a certain website to post all of our assignments online. But I also have a designated spot in my classroom where I write assignments. So things that are just what we're doing for the day are written in black. Things that are an assignment that need to be completed are written in a different color. I usually use red. Having a student repeat back those directions to the teacher or back to the student are really helpful. Giving time at the end of class for students to make sure they write it down. One thing that Maureen and I have found that's been really helpful is that we'll print out calendars just for the whole month. And when I give a project, let's say, and students have 2 weeks to work on it, we'll have students break down the project on sticky notes, and they'll put each of the sticky notes on the days they think they're going to complete it. Let's say day one, something came up that night, they weren't able to complete it. They peel that sticky note off and move it over to the next day. So there's a visual, okay, now I still have 2 things I need to do to get done. So with that visual representation, anything you can do visually will help with that time management, especially, for those larger projects. Using analog clocks is hands down one of the best things that I've used in the classroom as well, because kids need to visually see the time. This is how much time. If you can get a big clock on Amazon, an analog clock, and use an expo marker on it, you can highlight, this is how much time I think this assignment's going to take me, and then draw a line, this is how much time it actually took me. So kids can actually see that passage of time while they're working.
Okay, great. How about homework in general? There are several listeners who are pointing out that it's very hard to get through the homework hour, keeping their kids on task, getting started, not missing components. Do you have any advice on or strategies for parents who are struggling with all the executive functions inherent in homework?
Yeah, I think that sometimes mom and dad can be a really hard person to work with a student or work with their child. I've experienced that in my own home. Sometimes it's better if someone else steps in and helps through that process. Obviously, there's that, kind of witching hour when meds are starting to wear off. There's all sorts of variables and things that can get in the way of that homework time. What I have found to be successful, whether it's tutoring or whatever it is I'm doing after school with students, if I'm just visibly there, whether I'm working on something different or I'll chime in and help them if they need it. But my presence just being there helps the student stay focused and be able to get things done. I've had families say, well, I send them up to their bedroom and they're up there for 2 hours and they come back and they didn't get anything done. Well, they need that presence to help keep them going, not necessarily hovering or interfering too much if they don't need it, but just a presence there that is reminding them to, kind of keep going and to plug away. But yeah, we recognize that homework time can be really, really difficult. But again, sometimes having someone else step in has been really helpful as well.
Okay, great. What about motivation? Some listeners are saying that, they have a really hard time getting their children, a couple of specific mentions here, son, high school boys, to acknowledge that they have executive function problems and they need help, or to use planners or to use tools that their parents may have provided.
When it comes to that parenting dynamic, that becomes a big challenge, I think, with certain students or your own children. Sometimes you need a third party,
Right.
Sometimes you need that a therapist or a counselor who can be a bridge, who can listen to the child or the teen and help problem solve. One of the hardest things to see is sometimes with ADHD kids and their parents, there's just so much conflict,
Right.
that need to be done. And then that becomes such a, challenging part of their lives. So if it's ongoing and it's creating a lot of havoc in your family, possibly find that third person who can be a good interventionist. I think too, some kids are highly motivated by incentives. What's important to kids, I don't know if it's the driving, if it's the technology, it's, maybe you link incentives to some of those things, privileges,
Right.
You have to be responsible to do your homework. You have to be responsible to do these other things. So.
Yeah, some question here saying, our teen struggles, should we try to hire someone? And because he won't work with us. So I think you're confirming that that's a good idea. And she says, further, who does this kind of work? What have you seen to be successful in terms of someone working with a high school student on homework?
I would say teachers. Teachers oftentimes on the side will do private tutoring. That might be if there's somebody specifically that they work with during the day, that would be helpful. That oftentimes teachers will do that on the side through some, there are some, I guess, learning, organizations that will provide people as well. And those are a little bit more spendy, but I would definitely start with, either an older high school student or a college student or a teacher.
Okay. Yeah, I think I've seen high school students be successful tutors for younger high school students. I want to just go all the way back to elementary school, first, second, third, fourth grades. What are some skills that can be taught in the very early years that can serve as underpinnings for executive function skills when they are needed later on?
I think whatever you can do to add routines and that stop, pause, think, teach students, how much time things are going to take as you map things out in your day. If you can talk to, maybe it's the whole emotions, talk about how they manage their emotions, acknowledge that, they're going to have strong feelings, and then it's okay to have those feelings. But what can we do in school with those feelings when we have them? Behaviors. What do you do when you feel like you want to, maybe punch the kid next to you? Catch yourself before you get to that place. Maybe have a setup plan with the teacher. You take a little break. Maybe you go to the movement corner, or maybe you need to, take a lap. I don't know. If you can set some of the pieces up before they become problems or big challenges, that will help. And I guess that's really then linking with those parents to find out what they see as some of the challenges.
Yeah. And again, what Maureen said about the routine piece, my classroom is, everything's on a routine. And I think if kids can have that early on, it's really, really helpful. Kids like routine. They like to know what to do in case somebody's not there to give them those directions. So what's the plan for handing an assignment? What happens? What's the plan if I forget my assignment? You don't want a kid outside your classroom in tears because they forgot something at home. You want them to know this is a plan. It's okay if you forget your assignment. This is what we're going to do. This is our plan. And if everyone's aware of that, if you're following those routines, that's something that can be started early on in elementary school.
Okay. Sounds great. For building foundations early on. Here's a very specific question from someone that I think is intriguing and probably reflects the experiences of others listening in. She says, my 14-year-old is just starting 9th grade, can do very well in school, but It requires me spending many hours a week to help him break down the tasks to manageable chunks, monitoring what homework is because he can't take it all in, the information. And I really need the school to do better at supporting him. I feel like I'm constantly advocating and asking for help. And yet I'm still working, many hours a week with my child to make sure that he can manage the homework. Do you have some suggestions that I can try? We are starting a new school this year, and I'm hoping for a fresh start.
I think one of the key things that parents can do is, besides just saying that they've done a lot, like really log and document and keep track of all the things that have happened through your child's education. Build a case that your child needs some support. Reach out to the school psychologist, reach out to the counselor, maybe ask for multiple teachers to meet with you and your child. If I don't know how big your high school is, but lay out that these are the things we've been doing. There's that hard place where sometimes they have to fail. Sometimes parents have to step back a little bit. But that's hard when they're in high school too, because that's when the credits count. So I think if you don't hear it from one teacher that they're really to help, try the counselors, try the school psych, try the admin. I mean, someone needs to listen and hear what you've experienced. Right.
I think the idea of tracking, keeping a log is a really good idea in terms of making very specific what the needs are.
And having the child available as well to be part of that conversation. What does that student think they can help with? What kind of accommodations are they thinking would be helpful for them? Is important too, to keep them part of that conversation.
Right. Okay. Another one specific one. When my child tries to self-advocate in school, his teachers have disagreed with his requests, and one was downright nasty. I've recently had these items in his IEP, but the teachers don't always follow the IEP. How can I encourage him to try again this year with new teachers?
I do a lot of role playing with students that I work with. We go through scenarios. The kids will give me a scenario and we'll role play through that together. So again, the parent, you are the best advocate for your child and you know what they need. So just continue to encourage, role play different situations at home on how they could approach the teacher, what they maybe sending an email might be a different approach instead of doing it face to face, maybe writing a letter. Those are different ways of going about it. And just to continue to, encourage your child, and you are the best advocate and you know what your child needs. And so to stay strong and just encourage them to keep working at it. And if it's a legal document in their IEP or their 504, they have every right to have those accommodations put in place and followed.
Okay. Thank you so much, Karen and Maureen. It's a really interesting webinar. And I just want to remind everyone that Karen and Maureen have a consultation service called I Forgot to Remember, Executive Function Consulting. Email iforgottoremember@gmail.com. And I know there would be lots of interest, Karen and Maureen, in share in your survey, your executive function survey. There were many people who are wondering whether you would make copies of that available. So thanks so much. And for those of you who would like to have a certificate of attendance, please stay on. The survey will pop up and you'll complete it. Do not log off until you complete the survey and hit enter. And I'll tell those of you who are still here about the next two webinars, both for parents and school, both for back to school season. Thursday, August 29. How to reset the family schedule for school, how to create a calmer, happier, easier routine. And Thursday, September 5th, the best kind of discipline, how behavior parent training can transform your home life. So two great experts, Carolyn McGuire and Carla Allen. I think you'll enjoy those. Thanks again, everyone. For those of you, again, who'd like to have a certificate of attendance, please take the survey, which is ongoing now. And you should receive your certificate by email soon after you hit the send button. Thanks again, everyone.